Hi guys, these notes are going to be for the beginning of us starting chapter 7. So the heading for these notes should be chapter 7, section 1. And these notes are all about the electoral process, which is just another way of saying the way we elect officials, public officials. Some objectives, here's some key terms, just words with their definitions. And here's where we'll be discussing our focus question today, the methods for choosing candidates to run for public office. And we're going to talk about each of these ways today in the notes. So before we talk about each of the methods to how candidates are put into the primary, to be nominated to run for public office. So that is the nominating process. So that's going to be your first heading. So what is nomination? So if we're going to write a definition of nomination, so if you just wanted to write it out here beside where you wrote the nominating process, it is the process of selecting the candidates who will seek public office. It is a key function of the American political parties. So it's kind of, what the parties do. They get people nominated. So in the United States, we have something called a two-party system. So that means it is what it sounds. There's two parties. So in our two-party system, the nominating process puts limits. So puts limits on the choices available to voters in the general election. That's the nomination process. So there are countries where one party wins most general elections, so whoever wins the nomination is usually elected. That is not the United States because we only have two parties. It does flip-flop back and forth. And then those are all of the ways that we talked about in our focus question: self-announcement, caucus, convention, direct primary, or petition. We're not going to write those down because we're going to go into depth of each one of them now. So the first one we're going to discuss is self-announcement. Self-announcement. And that is when a person who wants to run for an office announces that they're going to run. So a person who wants to run for an office can simply announce that they're going to run. They can announce that fact. Whenever a write-in candidate appears, self-announcement has been used. So self-announcement is just when someone says, I'm going to run. My computer is freezing. Alright guys, I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened. So the second way that a candidate can run for public office is through the caucus. The caucus. In the early republic, key party members met in caucuses to nominate candidates. So that's not really what happens now, but that was how the caucus began. So what you need to know about that is that party members and state legislators held caucuses to nominate candidates for state office, while primary party caucuses in Congress nominated presidential candidates. So we're not going to worry about this bottom part, but so what is the caucus? In the early republic, key party members met in caucuses to nominate candidates. Doesn't happen a lot now, but that was the main way people were nominated in the beginnings of the Constitution, in the beginnings of the American elections. So the cons of caucuses, they do still exist today, but their function is a little different. They don't nominate. They are just kind of they're small groups who support a candidate. So they were criticized for being too small, too private, and out of touch with everyday party members. So those are the cons to the caucus. The next way that candidates can run for public office is a convention. So the conventions replaced caucuses. Voters choose delegates who attend the convention. So voters choose delegates who attend conventions where they pick party candidates and elect delegates to attend higher level conventions. So the conventions replaced caucuses. One of the cons about a convention is that they are controlled by party bosses. So the bigwigs, the people who raise the most money, they're kind of in charge of the conventions. The next way a candidate can run for public office is something called the direct primary. So it is now the nominating method used by the major parties in most states. In a primary, qualified voters cast private ballots for their preferred candidate. That's how, when you think of voting in the United States, that is what happens in a direct primary. You go to a voting booth and vote for your candidate. And then the person's receiving the most votes is the one that's nominated to the general election. So the primaries kind of root out people and leave only one person running for that political party. So the direct primary continued. The states regulate and conduct the party primary, so it's up to the states how it's done. So a different one is something called a closed primary. I've never seen one of those in my lifetime, but it's closed to all but declared members of a party. So it's closed to all but declared members of a party. Usually this means being a registered party member. The difference, the most common type, is the open primary, and it's open to all qualified voters. So like the presidential election, anybody can vote. So the difference, open versus closed primaries. So a closed primaries help make candidates more responsive to their party because they can be voted in or voted out. They force voters to choose a party affiliation. So you have to declare what party you're voting for. And it keeps the opposing party from raiding a primary and picking the weakest candidate. So only if you plan to vote Republican, then only Republicans would vote in this certain primary. So in an open primary, it does not exclude independent voters. Open primaries do not exclude independent voters. In many cases, open primary voters can also keep their choice of party private. So if you ever go vote and you have to declare what party you're voting for, that lets you know that it's a closed primary, usually. If it's an open primary, they don't ask you, because then on your screen, only a certain group of people, whoever you chose your party affiliation, that's who's going to show up for you to vote for. There are some other types of primaries. One that we've kind of heard a lot about in the news here in our last election cycle was a runoff primary, and is held between the top two vote getters. So it's usually when the majority of the vote. So like if somebody won 49% to 50%, they would say that that it was too close, and they would do a runoff primary. In most states, nearly all elected school and municipal officers are elected in nonpartisan elections where candidates are not identified. So like when you're voting for school board and things like that, that really doesn't have anything to do with a certain Republican or Democrat or independent. You're voting for just the candidates themselves. The majority winner would be awarded the office, or a lot of times they'll run unopposed where nobody else is running against that person, so they know they're going to be the winner. So here's a chart that talks about the different forms of primaries in the state elections. If you look at Tennessee, we're green, which means that we're an open primary, which means that, anybody can vote, public declaration. And that's where you tell what party you're for. The other kind of primary is a presidential primary. Depending on the state, party voters may use the presidential primary to choose delegates to their national party convention, to choose the candidate they want their parties to be. So party voters may use the presidential primary to choose delegates to their national convention. I don't think Tennessee does that. I don't ever recall seeing that on a ballot. And then it's also to choose their party's presidential nominee, obviously, or it could be both. So looking at primaries and evaluating it, because it is the most common way to run for a public office. So primaries, the good thing about them is they put the nominating process into the hands of the everyday party members, the voters. So some of the drawbacks or the cons is that primaries make campaigns more expensive, and voter turnout in primaries is usually less than half of what there is for a general election. So that is one thing. A lot of people don't vote in primaries. The primary process can also emphasize name familiarity over talent and can cause divisions within a party. Another way to run for public office is through petition. So now we're done talking about the primaries. So at the local level, so like Greene County officials, candidates may be nominated by petitions signed by a minimum number of qualified voters in the election district. So if you're running for like Greene County Sheriff or, the Board of Mayor and Aldermen or anything like that, then you usually have a petition that so many people sign. Many states require minor party and independent candidates to be nominated by petition. We're not going to worry about writing that. And that is the end of Chapter 7, Section 1 notes.